80 years later, I still can't explain what they did for us.
June 1943, Texas, midnight. Behind a fence of barbed wire, a German prisoner stands motionless, staring at something his mind cannot accept. Electric lights. Music. Laughter. America glows in the dark. For 3 years, he had been told that this country was weak, broken by capitalism, drowning in chaos. Yet here every farmhouse is lit, every street hums with power, every horizon pulses with industry. Even in war, the night is alive. He presses his hand against the wire. The metal hums faintly like the current running through this land. It is a sound he has never heard before, the sound of abundance. Somewhere beyond the fence, a train whistle cuts through the air. A Coca-Cola bottle clinks. The prisoner closes his eyes and, for the first time, doubts everything he believed in. That night, beneath the glowing Texas sky, thousands of German POWs began to see America not as an enemy, but as a question they could no longer answer. May 1943 North Africa burned beneath a sun that felt eternal. The war in Tunisia was over. The proud Afrika Korps, Rommel's once unstoppable army, had collapsed. Tank crews abandoned their machines, officers threw away medals, and men marched through dust with empty canteens and hollow eyes. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered to the Allies that month, the largest mass capitulation of German troops until that time. For most, it was not just the end of a campaign, it was the end of pride. They had fought through heat, disease, and starvation, only to be herded together like ghosts of a defeated empire. They waited for judgment, for execution, for revenge. No one expected mercy. Rumors spread through the desert columns. The Americans shoot prisoners. They send them to dig uranium in the mines. They experiment on them like animals. Each step toward the sea felt like a step closer to death. But what awaited them was not gallows, it was machinery. Steel cranes, massive ships lined up along the African coast. Names painted in white: Liberty, Victory, Joseph Hughes. Ships that had been built not in years, but in days, 5 days from keel to launch. Factories in Baltimore, Portland, New Orleans ran without sleep. Men and women welded steel plates in sparks of fire, assembling vessels faster than the Reich could destroy them. And now, those ships waited for the very men who had tried to sink them. The prisoners were ordered aboard. They climbed the ramps in silence, expecting chains, barking guards, and kicks from rifle butts. Instead, they met calm voices. A soldier handing out canteens, another offering cigarettes. One young sailor smiled awkwardly and said, "Welcome aboard." The words struck harder than a slap. Below deck, they found bunks with blankets, water barrels, even soap. The air smelled of metal and salt. Mess lines formed. Trays were filled with bread, beans, and slices of meat. No one believed it was real. One officer wrote that night, "They fed us before they questioned us." I began to suspect that our world had been upside down. The journey across the Atlantic took weeks. Winds howled. Rain hammered the deck. But there was order. The guards followed strict conduct, no beatings, no insults, no forced labor. It was discipline, not cruelty. Even the Red Cross parcels arrived on schedule. In the quiet of the night, when the ship rolled gently on the waves, some prisoners gathered by the portholes. They stared into the darkness, trying to imagine America, the enemy land, waiting beyond the sea. What kind of nation treated its enemies with respect while fighting them with everything it had? A sergeant whispered to another, "If they treat prisoners like this, what must their soldiers live like?" The other man said nothing, just stared at his reflection in the black water. For the first time, doubt, not fear, filled their hearts. Days blurred into nights. Somewhere between Africa and America, hatred began to dissolve. The old slogans, Sieg Heil, Vaterland, honor and blood, felt distant, hollow, almost childish. They were no longer marching for glory. They were sailing toward a mystery. One diary entry, found years later in a box of returned belongings, read, "We left the desert defeated, but somewhere on this ocean, defeat became education. The enemy we feared had built ships faster than we built lies." Late June 1943, the Atlantic voyage ended. Through the grey morning fog, the Liberty ships slid into Norfolk, Virginia. For the men leaning against the railings, the first sight of America was nothing like what propaganda had promised. They expected ruins, chaos, hunger, a dying world of capitalism. Instead, they saw cranes moving like giants over sparkling water, ships unloading cargo, cars rolling along shining roads, factories puffed white smoke into the summer sky, and everywhere lights. It was morning, but the lights were still on. America was awake even in daylight. The sound of jazz drifted from a radio near the docks. Women in bright dresses handed out coffee to dock workers. Children waved small flags as the ships approached. A German lieutenant whispered, "Impossible. This country fights a war and still shines." His comrade said nothing, just watched the endless skyline that glittered like glass. From Norfolk, the prisoners boarded Pullman rail cars, long, green, air-conditioned trains built for comfort. Each car had bunks, curtains, and a small kitchen. Even the guards treated them like passengers, not prisoners. As the trains thundered across the American heartland, they stared through the windows, speechless. Out there, cities alive with movement, billboards for Coca-Cola, Ford, Lucky Strike cigarettes. Women on bicycles, farmers driving tractors gleaming with new paint, neon signs blinking in the night. The lights never went out, one prisoner later wrote. America was at war, but it looked like peace. For men who came from a continent buried in rubble and ration cards, this was a hallucination. How could a nation fighting on two fronts look richer than it had before? When the train stopped for fuel, the POWs caught their reflections in the glass. Tired, bearded, uniforms torn, yet behind them rolled a land overflowing with power and confidence. Even small towns looked modern. Gas pumps, diners, movie theaters. One prisoner murmured, "They told us Americans were slaves to machines." Maybe that's true, but they built machines that serve them back. The farther west they went, the wider the world became. The forests of Tennessee gave way to open plains, then deserts, then the wide skies of Texas and Oklahoma. And there, behind newly built fences, rose their destination. Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, Camp Gruber, entire towns made of wood and wire, prepared to hold thousands of men. As the train slowed to a stop, an officer ordered them out. They expected shouting, perhaps the butt of a rifle. Instead, American guards simply said, "This way, gentlemen." That single word, gentlemen, struck harder than a command. When night fell, they saw it again. Lights. Row after row of lamps glowing inside the camps, while across the ocean, German cities sat in darkness. That night, lying on clean mattresses, they couldn't sleep. The air smelled of soap, corn, and electricity. Somewhere outside, a jukebox was playing In the Mood. One man wrote in his diary, "I have seen the enemy's strength. It is not his weapons, but his abundance." Summer, 1943, Central Texas. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and dust as the trains rolled to a stop near a cluster of wooden barracks surrounded by fences. A sign read simply, "Camp Hearn." This would be home for thousands of German prisoners, a home built by the very enemy they had once sworn to destroy. When the guards ordered them to disembark, the prisoners looked around in disbelief. They expected mud, cages, brutality. But what they saw looked more like a small American town. Rows of neat houses, electricity lines humming overhead, water towers gleaming under the sun. Inside each barrack, clean beds, working lights, a small stove for the cold months. It wasn't luxury, but it was human. Each man was registered, issued a uniform, marked PW, given medical checks, soap, razors, and bedding. Meals were served 3 times a day. Breakfast, eggs, toast, coffee. Lunch, stew and vegetables. Dinner, meat, potatoes, even dessert on Sundays. A German officer whispered, half ashamed, "This is more than our families have at home." For many, it was the first time in years they slept without fear. The barbed wire still loomed outside, but inside the camp there was order not by the whip, but by schedule. There were rules, inspections, and morning roll calls, yet no hatred. The guards treated them as soldiers, not animals. Soon, daily life began to take shape. Work details were organized: construction, farming, kitchen duty, or carpentry. Those who cooperated earned small wages enough to buy cigarettes, candy, or paper at the camp canteen. There was a barber, a tailor, even a small bakery, a hospital with X-ray machines and penicillin. Some prisoners joked that the camp was safer than Berlin. What astonished them most was the food waste. If meals weren't finished, leftovers were discarded. A sergeant stared in disbelief at a bin full of bread crusts and meat scraps. Back home, Germans queued for hours for black bread. Here, abundance was so normal it bordered on careless. By autumn, the camps had become communities. They built libraries with German books, orchestras with donated instruments, and theatres from scrap wood. Evenings filled with singing Lily Marlene drifting through the Texas dusk. For Christmas, 1943, the Red Cross delivered gifts, and the Americans allowed a full holiday feast: turkey, cake, and choir performances. It was the strangest captivity imaginable, one that felt almost like freedom. The psychological effect was profound. The men had been raised on the idea of racial superiority, told that mercy was weakness. But here they met guards who smiled, doctors who healed, and civilians who waved from passing trucks. It was disorienting and deeply unsettling. A young private wrote in his notebook, "They fight hard, but they do not hate. It is impossible to despise a people who feed you better than your own army." Some camps even held art exhibitions: watercolor paintings of sunsets, portraits of guards, carvings of eagles and ships. American visitors came to see them and left amazed at the civility inside the fences. Reporters called Herne the Fritz Ritz, comparing it to a hotel more than a prison. Not every man accepted it easily. Some hardline Nazis organized secret groups, preaching loyalty and fear. They burned letters, beat those who spoke kindly of Americans, and called them traitors. But even they could not silence what everyone saw: a nation that conquered not by cruelty, but by calm confidence. At night, the camps glowed faintly with electric light. From afar, the scene could be mistaken for any rural town in America: houses, laughter, the clink of dishes from a mess hall. Somewhere beyond the fence, swing music played on a radio. Inside, men who once marched under the swastika now played chess, wrote poems, and wondered what freedom truly meant. Many would later recall this time not as imprisonment, but as revelation. Here, they discovered that dignity could survive even behind wire if it was given, not taken. And in that quiet, well-fed captivity, the cracks in the Nazi myth deepened. They had entered the camp as soldiers of the Reich. But every night, as lights glowed across the Texas plains, they felt themselves slowly becoming something else: men again. By 1944, the war in Europe was still raging, but behind the fences of America, another kind of war had begun. Not a war of bullets, but of ideas. It was fought in classrooms made of plywood, with chalk and notebooks instead of rifles, and for thousands of German prisoners, it would be the battle that truly changed them. After a year of captivity, the American War Department launched what they called the Intellectual Diversion Program. Its mission was radical: re-educate the enemy not by force, but by curiosity. Each camp received books, paper, dictionaries, and films. German-speaking professors were recruited from universities across the US to teach subjects once forbidden under the Reich: history without censorship, science without dogma, politics without fear. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, they painted a slogan on the classroom wall: "We came as soldiers, we will leave as men." The first lessons were simple English phrases: world geography, American civics. But soon, the subjects deepened. They discussed Plato's Republic, Lincoln's speeches, the Bill of Rights. They read of Mice and Men and the Federalist Papers. Some debated capitalism versus socialism without fear of arrest. A prisoner named Hans Richter wrote, "For the first time, we were allowed to think, and no one told us what the correct answer should be." The camps even had their own newspapers, over 135 different publications, written, printed, and edited entirely by prisoners. Articles explored art, literature, psychology, and the moral failures of Nazism. They argued with one another through essays, not fists. One headline read, "Freedom begins with doubt." In Camp Herne, a group of musicians composed symphonies and taught music theory. Another group formed a debating club. Some men who had once served as Hitler Youth leaders now taught others about democracy. An American officer noted, "They were dismantling their old faith, one conversation at a time." Evenings were filled with films from the Office of War Information movies, showing the founding of America, the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, and recovery through free enterprise. Prisoners who had believed democracy was chaos now saw something else: a nation that admitted its failures, yet rebuilt stronger each time. Then came the moment that no classroom could prepare them for. 1945. The war was turning. Camps received reels of film footage from the liberated concentration camps of Europe. The Americans dimmed the lights and ran the projector. On the screen appeared the truth: skeletal survivors, mass graves, the silence of horror. No voiceover, no propaganda, just reality. Many prisoners turned away. Some wept openly. A few shouted that it was fake, but even they could not keep watching. The air felt heavy, suffocating. One prisoner wrote that night, "I had believed in an idea called Germany. What I saw was a grave for the idea of humanity. It was the breaking point. The indoctrination of years dissolved in minutes." For many, that was the moment they stopped being soldiers and started being men again. The Americans didn't celebrate. They simply left the lights on and the door unlocked. The prisoners stayed up all night, talking softly in the barracks, not about guns or glory, but about guilt and the future, and what kind of people they wanted to be when they went home. When asked later what changed them, one man said, "It wasn't lectures. It was being treated as if we could learn again." By 1945, America had turned its camps into universities behind barbed wire, and the most powerful weapon it used was not the atomic bomb, but the open mind. Spring 1945. The war was nearly over. Germany was in ruins, the Reich collapsing under the weight of its own lies. But in the POW camps of America, a different kind of destruction was taking place, silent, invisible, yet absolute. The destruction of faith. For 2 years, these men had lived behind fences, surrounded by decency. They had seen discipline without brutality, power without arrogance, freedom without chaos. And now, with every newspaper headline, with every rumor from Europe, the world they once believed in fell apart piece by piece. The first cracks had appeared months earlier in the classrooms, in the debates, in the long nights after the film screenings. But now, the collapse was complete. Letters from home told of bombed cities, of children starving, of families digging through rubble. The words "total victory" no longer appeared in the mail. Instead, phrases like "hopeless," "defeat," and "nothing left." Men who once shouted "Sieg Heil" now read those words in silence, heads bowed over trembling hands. "Everything we were told was wrong," one prisoner wrote. "The enemy we feared turned out to be more human than our own leaders." For years, they had worshipped an idea: Germany as destiny, the Führer as father. Now, that faith turned to ash. One man burned his swastika armband in a trash barrel behind the barracks. Another tore pages from Mein Kampf to use as kindling for a stove. They no longer hated America, they hated what had been done to their souls. In Camp Swift, a small group gathered each night under the bare light of a bulb. They called it the Circle of Reflection. There, they confessed not to priests, but to each other. What they had seen, what they had done, what they had believed. A corporal admitted he once reported his neighbor for listening to foreign radio. Another had turned away when Jewish classmates disappeared. No one judged. They simply listened and understood. It was the birth of conscience. An American chaplain, Father O'Donnell, once entered quietly during one of these meetings. He didn't speak. When asked later why he never preached to them, he said, "Because they're already hearing the truth, and it's louder than any sermon." Outside, the radio from the command building hummed with news from Europe. Hitler dead. Berlin fallen. Germany surrendered. Some prisoners cheered softly. Others wept. Not for the Reich, but for the realization that everything had been meaningless. For some, the end of the war felt like the end of a dream. For others, it was the first breath of reality. That evening, at Camp Herne, a group of prisoners stood facing the sunset. They removed their caps. One man whispered, "So this is what defeat feels like." Another answered, "No, this is what truth feels like." For the first time in years, they no longer felt hatred. They felt grief, and through grief, understanding. From that day forward, the camp grew quieter. The laughter from the canteen softened. The soccer matches slowed. Men spent more time writing, reading, and watching the horizon. In one diary, found decades later in a German attic, a man wrote, "The barbed wire was supposed to keep us in, but what it really did was keep the lies out." America had not broken them through power, but through patience. It had defeated an ideology without firing a shot. Summer 1946. The fences were coming down. Across the United States, trucks rolled through dusty roads carrying thousands of men to the docks. They were going home, but not to the same Germany they had left. 3 years earlier, they had arrived in fear and hatred. Now, they left with notebooks, English dictionaries, letters and sketches, souvenirs of a country that had conquered them not with weapons, but with dignity. At the harbour, a young prisoner named Karl stood with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He turned once more toward the American flag flapping above the pier. It wasn't victory or defeat that filled his chest, but a strange kind of gratitude. "They took my rifle," he wrote in his diary, "but they gave me back my humanity." The ships that had once carried soldiers from Africa to America now carried them home again. But these men were not the same. They had learned how democracy functioned, how debate replaced orders, how freedom demanded responsibility. They had seen kindness wielded as power, and truth accepted as a duty, not a threat. When the convoy crossed the Atlantic, they looked west for the last time. Lights shimmered on the distant horizon, America fading into night. No one spoke. The silence was full of understanding. Weeks later, the ships docked in Bremen, Hamburg, and Bremerhaven. Cities broken, hollow, burned to their bones. The smell of smoke and ash clung to the air. Children played in bomb craters. Mothers lined up for bread that never arrived. Many POWs stood frozen, unable to move down the gangplank. They had left a land of abundance for a wasteland of memory. In letters and memoirs, they described that first shock. We had returned to Germany, but it no longer felt like home. Some wept. Others simply walked, silently, into the ruins carrying ideas rather than orders. They found their families thin, their homes gone, their beliefs shattered. But somewhere inside, a new seed had taken root. In towns like Munich, Stuttgart, and Cologne, former POWs began organizing community meetings. They taught English, repaired schools, opened newspapers. A few entered politics, insisting on open elections. Some became teachers, others journalists, engineers, diplomats. They were called the America Men, the ones who had seen freedom and brought a piece of it back. A former camp librarian, Wilhelm Schulte, became mayor of a small town in Westphalia. When asked how he learned to govern, he smiled. In prison, the Americans let us practice. Another man, Heinrich Bauer, helped rebuild the Stuttgart press. He refused all censorship, insisting, "Democracy only works when the truth can breathe." And breathe it did. Within a decade, West Germany rose from rubble into a modern democracy. Its new constitution echoed the principles once taught behind American fences. Individual rights, the rule of law, freedom of speech. Historians later called it the quiet export of American democracy. But for the men who had lived it, it was simpler. They had seen what humanity looked like, and they could never unsee it. Some even returned to America years later, not as prisoners, but as guests. They visited the towns where they had once been held, met the farmers who had offered them coffee, the guards who had shared a cigarette by the gate. Photographs were taken, men in suits shaking hands where rifles once stood. Karl, the young man from Herne, wrote one last entry before closing his diary forever. They say war teaches hate. But for me, it taught love, because I met an enemy who refused to hate me back. And so, the prisoners of war carried home something greater than victory or defeat. They carried home the idea that freedom, once seen, could never be forgotten. The war had ended long ago. The guns were silent, the flags folded, the camps dismantled. But somewhere in the quiet fields of Texas, the wind still carried faint echoes, laughter, footsteps, a language once foreign but now familiar. What remained was not the story of defeat, but of transformation. History often counts victory in numbers, tanks destroyed, enemies captured, territories gained. But America's greatest triumph in that war was none of these. It was a victory invisible to maps and medals, a victory of spirit. Behind the fences of its POW camps, America fought a different kind of battle. It did not conquer through hunger or fear, but through fairness. It did not force obedience, but inspired reflection. And in doing so, it dismantled the very idea that tyranny could control the human heart. The men who had come as enemies left as men reborn. They carried home no weapons, no trophies, only memories. Of warm coffee on a cold morning, of a guard who smiled without contempt, of electric lights burning against the darkness. Years later, many would tell their children, "I learned democracy not from a book, but from the way America treated its prisoners." That was the war America won without firing a shot. A war fought not with bullets, but with decency, not with power, but with patience, not to destroy, but to teach. In every century, nations build weapons of destruction. But here, in the middle of a world on fire, one nation proved that kindness could be mightier than steel. The men who once marched under the swastika returned home with something far greater than victory, understanding. And as the lights of the Texas camps finally went dark, their glow lingered, in hearts changed forever, in a Germany rebuilt upon the ashes of its guilt, and in a truth that endures through time. Freedom cannot be taught by force. It can only be shown.